Hello and welcome back, and today we're going to continue looking at performance benchmarks of the brand new Synology HAT5300. This is part 2 in my series of test videos where we're looking at this drive. In our previous video, which is hopefully linked to on the side of the screen or a card, and there'll be a link in the description, we looked at single drive utilization. We did a bunch of tests on just a single drive to see whether the performance benchmarks were up to scratch. In today's video, we are going to be looking at RAID utilization in the DS1621XS Plus. Now, we only got the 4 drives that we're utilizing today, and we're going to be putting these into a RAID 5 environment, and from there also some RAID 0 stuff as well, hopefully maybe in this video or in a follow-up video. It's going to take overnight to get a RAID 5 on this bad boy up and running. Then we're going to do some 10 GBE performance testing. Now, we've only got the 4 drives to utilize today. The reason we're going for 4 drives is, one, because I do think that's a good enough amount of storage there to saturate a good degree of a 10 GBE connection. And of course, as mentioned in future videos, we will be comparing against drives from other brands as well within the field of network attached storage. Now, for those that aren't aware, this is the 8TB model. It takes advantage of Toshiba architecture. And again, as mentioned in other videos, they've been incredibly transparent about that. They've even got Toshiba model IDs, and the external packaging does mention that it's a Toshiba brand drive with the Synology firmware on board. And what we're going to be doing is installing these drives inside there. The 8TB model has proposed in excess of 240 megabytes per second performance on the drive, and of course RAID 5 will allow us to get even higher than that. We're going to be running a bunch of 10G tests with this system here. The reason we've gone for it, obviously, is it's 10G on board. We're not going to be utilizing M2 NVMe caching. None of that. Is just going to be pure drive utilization in the RAID environment. And we're looking forward to seeing just what these drives can promise, because obviously there's a lot of contention out there for some users that didn't really like the fact that Synology, on their more enterprise level rack mounts that have arrived in 2021, are kind of locked in on compatibility with just these drives, with a couple of minor exceptions. So on the flip side of that, we're seeing a lot of users looking at the architecture of these drives, the 550 TB workload per year, the 5-year warranty, the MTTF, the durability factor, the load cycles, and they're going, well, do you know what? I might stick these inside a smaller NAS as well. So a lot of today's video is about finding out these drives generally across the whole range and whether they're worth your time. Remember the stuff about firmware updates we did in another video? That's another advantage as well. But really, for a number of us, it comes down to the performance. We want to know that these drives are going to give us the kind of throughput that makes the investment inside one of these systems worth the while. So again, largely designed for rack mount and enterprise use, but today's video is about utilizing it to a lesser kind of scale there. So let's get these drives inside here. Okay, so we've booted up our Synology DS1621XS Plus, and we've installed all 4 of our drives. If we go into the storage manager, we can see all 4 of the 8TB Synology HAT5300 drives here. And we've already created a volume already. Now, the first thing we're going to be working on is that RAID 0 today. We're going to go with a RAID 0, and then after this test is done, we're going to reset the device and go on to a RAID 5 afterwards. So don't worry, you haven't got to wait long. Although it's going to take me another day to make a RAID 5, you just have to wait a handful of minutes. So, how are we going to conduct today's test? Well, we're going to be conducting this over 10 GBE, as mentioned. So, if we go into the control panel here, we're able to look into the network connections, and you'll see that I've already created a 10G connection here. We're using the 10 gigabit Ethernet port featured on the 1621XS. We've set the jumbo frames or /MTU packets, etc. to 9000. And on the other side of things, on my network connection, we are using a Thunderbolt 10G adapter, also running at 10 GBE. And if we go into the configuration settings there, we'll be able to see much the same in the advanced tab. We can go into jumbo packet and boom, select 9K there. So we'll let that get sorted out, and I'll re-establish that connection with this. It won't change anything to do with the IP, don't worry. And while that's doing that in the background, we can have a look and we can see the NAS is listed twice. We've got a 1 gigabit Ethernet connection there and a 10 GBE connection there. But of course, we're focusing on that 10G. Now, I don't expect all 4 of these drives to fill a 1000 megs connection, but I do expect it to be a decent enough level where we're saturating a good degree of it. Now, I have created a shared folder inside. If we go into the file station area, we can see I've created a shared folder known as HAT5300 drive share, and again that's in the RAID 0. We will be reusing a new one in the RAID 5 environment, and on top of that we can make our way into the application from Synology here. Make sure we select the 10 GBE connected drive there. We're going to map a network drive. I'm going to log in, and from there we're going to go ahead and connect with the drive in question. Clicking next. I'm going to give it a letter. We're going to go for the nice simple letter S for Synology. Open the map network drive upon completion, and this will allow us to create that 10G connection there. I could have gone with a nice SCSI, but the map network drive should be more than enough for today's testing, at least in the RAID 0. Nice and easy testing. We'll be doing lots of comparative testing with iSCSI LUN targets and the iSCSI manager in DSM 6.2 soon enough. So we've got our drive sorted out there, so we can leave that maybe to one side of the screen, or better yet, let's get the resource monitor up on screen. Throughout the course of these tests, let's get that there. And while that resource monitor records what we're doing right now, we're not going to look at CPU utilization. Let's look at disk utilization here, and we're going to switch that over to the transfer rate. And from here, we're going to go into our first test on AJA. AJA, we always utilize that for a lot of our testing. It's just the most graphically understandable, even on an early doors thing, and we can look at things like Atto disk benchmark and stuff like that later on. But let's load up AJA and make into our first stage of testing. Let's open that up there. There at the bottom, it's a 4 gig test file we're going to be utilizing here. We're going to go with the drive share. Actually, let's go with a nice easy 1 gig test file, which should be nice and fast. And again, we're not using any kind of disk caching. We're just going to do a continuous test there in the background. The only other thing I would add before we begin is to bear in mind we are using OBS screen recording, which because of the demand on the GPU may hamper some of our results the tiniest pinch. So it's worth bearing that in mind, but we should be able to tell straight away. But without further ado, let's begin our test. So, rather pleasingly, we have actually maxed that connection, which again is going to be interesting to see if it can maintain that throughput at the larger file test sizes. Again, we are using a RAID 0, so it's worth highlighting that we're not really having redundancy here. It's still nice to have that full speed there, but still nevertheless, we are doing this at the expense of redundancy there throughout. And we can see there on the left hand side of the screen, again, we're not really getting enough time in this 1 gig test file to get a true indicator of the performance we're seeing. So if we stop that file test there, and now we move into a larger file type, this should give us a much more accurate reading on the performance, because it's a larger file with which it's going to ascertain that nice overall performance. So you will notice the speed drop to something a little bit more realistic now in terms of these 4 drives. Bear in mind that each one of these drives has a marketed 230 megabytes per second at the 8 TB limit. The larger capacity is increasing by around 10, 15, 20 megabytes per second each respective tier. But at these 4 drives in a RAID 0, we're still getting some great speed there over that 10 GBE connection with my connected system. You're going to start to hear the fan on my test system ramp up a little bit there. You almost certainly have heard the Synology in the background in that metal chassis making a few clinks and clonks along the way. But still, I think we're seeing a little bit more of an accurate representation of that performance there on the drive in the RAID 0 environment. So for now, let's stop that there. And now we're going to make our way into that the 16 gig test file there. I'm going to let that stop properly. So from there, we're going to make our way into the 16 gig test file, and this is going to be that giant file type there, where we are going to really see a lot more of the consistency that these drives promise, if indeed they do. So let's go ahead and begin our 16 gig test file. And this is going to be a much slower burn, and again, this speed is going to dip, and it's what we're interested to see is what is this number going to be at the end of the 16 gig transfer. It's still consistently high, and we are living in the 800s, peaking, I would say, logically at around about the 850, 860 there. Obviously, write being what it is, but read right now as we access that same file that AJA has moved over. Again, we're seeing that performance played out very nicely. I think the read, there's something slightly off there on that read performance. And again, a lot of that could be my own core internal system. But I think for now, these are still pretty good figures to be assessing there for 16 gig. We're going to let them run through one last time before we switch over to another testing application. And from there, we're going to get ready for our RAID 5 configuration, which is going to take overnight to build. But write is still delivering that nice, consistent performance that we were hoping for. Read, I do think we're seeing something slightly off there in the transition between them. It could easily be the Thunderbolt adapter. But for now, just focus on that write performance, really. I think the read, we may be having consistency problems with my own internal SSD there that's creating a slight bottleneck. Because I know the read performance in every other test we've done has spiked quite dramatically. So we're going to stop that one there. We've done those two big old tests for us for later on. Now we're going to switch over to Atto Disk Benchmark. Right, so to get things set up for our Atto Disk Benchmark test, it should be remembered that we're going to have to set up an iSCSI target here. As we see, I've already made one, but for those that do want to make an iSCSI target in future, just remember to utilize the iSCSI Manager or SAN Manager in DSM-7, which will be installed by default, and then you can head into these tabs to create an iSCSI or LUN target. Make sure you make a note of the IQN number there, or just keep a note of the IP up there. For Windows users, head down to the bottom and type in iSCSI, and then you will get the iSCSI Initiator tool. And from there, go into Discovery, go to Discovery Portal, and from there, you can enter the IP and it will find your iSCSI target here. Once you've done that, head into the PC folder on your computer, click the Manage tab here at the top, and from there, make your way into the Storage tab, then Disk Management, and the iSCSI that you've connected with the iSCSI Initiator will appear here at the bottom, just as I've done here. And again, I will be doing a full breakdown on this for another video, because I do think now I talk about it, this isn't a subject I tackle enough. But it'll allow you to mount it just like you would any other drive. And from here, we're going to be running our tests with Atto Disk Benchmark. We're going to be looking at the read and write, of course, but we're also concentrating on those IOPS as well. So let's get the Storage Manager back up. And from here, we want to look at what our drives are doing. Let's get the resource monitor back. And remember, we will be repeating all of these things later on, utilizing a RAID 5 configuration. But for now, let's head back into Atto Disk Benchmark. Let's keep that on screen. And this time, we're going to make sure we have IOPS there listed on screen from the drives happening in real time from the Synology. We can look at all of them if we choose as well. Let's move that slightly more visible online there. And from there, let's put Atto Disk Benchmark. Let's select the IOPS tab. And what we're going to do is run this IOPS test of this RAID 0 environment. We're going to ramp that up to a potential 4 gig, so it will get a bit slow towards the end there. Bear in mind, of course, hard drives are not really IOPS centric. When we do measure IOPS, we generally look at SSDs, but nevertheless, when it comes to enterprise hard drives in a RAID environment, it never hurts to look at IOPS, because although they won't challenge the likes of SSDs, still nevertheless it's interesting to see. So let's go ahead and begin our IOPS check. And we're going to fast forward to the completion of this exercise. We're going to let it start up first to make sure it's all running fine. And we're going to monitor the IOPS first. And from here, see what this RAID 0 configuration of 4 HAT5300 8TB Synology hard drives can provide for us. Right, so the Atto Disk Benchmark test tool has completed its run through. We're seeing quite a lot of the mid to early, in the early stages, definitely some high teens there in terms of the IOPS in the thousands. If we switch over, of course, to the read and write, we're still seeing a lovely consistent 1K there. I can say one writes out at 1.15 GB, that kind of hitting the maximum there of what is even possible via 10 GBE, but we're still seeing lovely consistent performance there of this RAID 0 4 disk environment. Now, We're going to end things here in terms of the RAID 0, and we're going to begin setting things up for our RAID 5 configuration, which we're still going to do. So once again, for you, this is going to be mere minutes, but for me, we are talking at least 24 hours. So what we're going to do is come out of there. Next, we're going to go ahead and start cancelling out some of the things we've set up for this video. Lots of background noise outside the window behind me, which is super annoying. We're going to remove our iSCSI target there. So we're going to go ahead and remove it, because it's just going to make things difficult to try and do this afterwards while we still have that maintained connection. At the same time, from my side, I am going to sever the connection with that drive. We're going to delete that volume and go from there. Oh, maybe I should type the password in without a caps lock. And what we're going to do is just completely format this area of storage. We're going to remove our volume, and we're going to remove our storage pool even, and we're going to start to build our RAID 5 environment. Now, once again, RAID 5 is probably the configuration that most of us are going to be utilizing. Most people would utilize a RAID 5 because it has one disk of safety net on there. So what I'm going to do is, while that gets ready and formatting our existing configuration there in the background, we can get ready on our side. For me, I can now format this area that we've been doing here. So we're just going to delete that volume and get rid of the iSCSI we've created earlier on. While that's doing that, we'll go ahead and we're going to create this RAID 5. We're not going to go for an SHR, which isn't, of course, possible on this device. I'm going to call this one our RAID 5 HAT5300. For disk. Cool. From there, as you see, it's a RAID 5 environment. We're utilizing our disks. We're going to move over all 4 disks in our configuration, and this is going to be set up pretty quickly, but the synchronization will almost certainly take overnight there for you guys. Right, so fast forward to the next day, and here we are at our completed RAID 5 on this Synology NAS using those HAT5300 drives. The RAID 5 is completed. As you see there, fully synchronized. We've got that 1 disk of redundancy, so 3 disks of storage. We've got the volume already created. We've already set up our iSCSI LAN target. We've got it already set up on the machine. And if we go into the computer down here at the bottom, we've got both the new volume there for that 2 TB already present there. The only thing we need to do now is map our network drive. That's the last thing we needed to do. So let's go ahead and make our way into that. Let's map the drive, log in as before. And what we're going to do is, once again, we're going to be running all the exact same tests. We'll go to drive T. And again, I know we could just conduct all of these tests on the iSCSI, but I think we'll reserve the iSCSI treatment as before for when we use Atto disk benchmark, and we will utilize the map network drive for more traditional drag and drop utilization. So let's start with our first test once again. We're going into AJA. We're going to start with that 1 gig test file again. And again, if we drop down, we have got both the new map drive there, and we've got the iSCSI. And just to just to give you an idea about this, we are going to test them both real quickly, but proceeding afterwards, we'll just stick with the map network drive where appropriate. So first, we'll go with the map drive again. No background caching taking place there at all, and again, we are using OBS there in the background to record the dialogue, so it may affect some of the graphical stuff on screen. Last thing I will add is, unlike the RAID 0 testing, one of the early things you will notice very quickly on a RAID 5 is the spin up is slightly different. And by spin up, I don't really mean the physical spinning up of the drives so much as the access readiness of a storage array. A RAID 0 is far more instantaneous, whereas in a RAID 5, because the system has to create all of that parity data while it goes across each layer as it randomly goes through and puts data on the disks, and that parity jumps each time to each disk, so we've got that redundancy. The result will be that spin up will be more noticeable, not just in noise, maybe a little bit in the background. We're not running an audio setup today, but you will certainly notice it in the spin up compared to what we saw before. But for now, let's do a quick run. And this is the mapped network drive again on the RAID 5 configuration over 10 GBE with the MTU set at 9000. Just a reminder there for those that missed it at the beginning of the previous video. And you can see there what I meant about the spin. Even at the 1G level, whereas on the previous test we were hitting that 1000 megs either side, even at the 1 GB test file, This time the write there is a pinch lower because of the added processing required into a RAID 5 configuration with the system calculating that parity. If we took this to a RAID 6 configuration, which is a bit negligible on a 4-disk array even though it is supported, you would see that dip go even lower. And again, before we make our step into a larger test file, just to show you, this is the iSCSI target. And as you can see, the iSCSI target does give us a greater performance compared with that of the map network drive. And a lot of that is protocol based. But again, iSCSI a little bit more technical for some. If you are prepared to go down that road and set up an iSCSI target, does open up remote access with things like WebDAV as well, that kind of line on things. But the advantages are here and there in terms of a technical level setup and trying to relocate drives later on. It's nowhere near as easy as a map network drive. Again, performance benefits, but a little bit more technical. So switching back to the map network drive there, we're now going to switch onto a 4 gig test file. And again, we're going with a mapped drive and we're going to go ahead and run our 4 gig test file. Now, this is the larger test file, so we can see that run down, slowly dip down as the system has to deal with a lot more of the parity creation there in the RAID 5. And this is what I meant there, looking at the read about the calculation there on the side. Now, I'd already noted in my previous test that the read performance wasn't as high as I would have liked in a lot of our testing, and I had a look into the task manager while waiting for this RAID 5 to complete, and a lot of this is because of OBS rating. It does make things very difficult on my core side. If I deactivated the OBS application, that read speed does jump up quite notably, and if we go for some of the other file types that are easier for processor to handle, but the result still remains that if I turn off the screen recording, you're not going to see the results. I could have done an off camera, but we're not going to do that because we've done that in previous tests and it's not as legible as what we see here on screen. So maybe give a bit of a pinch of salt there to read performance throughout these tests. Let's end that there, and now we're going to flick into a 16 gig test file. So again, much larger, so it will take longer to complete, but we'll let that run there. We're just going to let that start off. We're going to watch that 1000 megs dip quite significantly. I think we'll be lucky if we get away with 400 or 500 meg here, although we should find a nice little average. We're slowing down, so we're sitting there at the 600, so pretty respectable right now, given that each one of these drives promotes a 230 megabytes per second performance. 600 megs at 10 GBE on a RAID 5 is still pretty impressive for a write as far as I'm concerned. Now the read is going to have that build up, but I think we're going to see a build up and a build down throughout this wave. So we're going to let it complete there. Looking at the graph there at the bottom for write, it was very much the jumpy atmosphere one would expect from a RAID 5 configuration. The read is peaking. We're giving it more time to play with there. So again, we're going to get a better reading there on read, gotta say. We'll let that finish there. And again, rather than let that run another rotation, let's just show you what that would have been had we been running the mapped network drive. We're going to see an improvement in performance, certainly, but is it going to be a notable improvement there? So let's let that run as the iSCSI target there. Are we going to see that same 600 odd? Because we seem to have dipped down to 600 quite significantly faster there. I'm going to be totally upfront with you guys. I've got a really nice coffee here on the go, and I'm just going to have some while you guys watch that. Absolute delight. Fantastically unprofessional, I know, but come on, we've all got to live. Look at the time of the day there in the bottom right of the screen. We'll let that finish. The read is gathering up. The write there still maintain that 460 even on the iSCSI. So again, the difference on such a huge 16 gigabyte test file there over 10G, we're still getting some very good performance. Do bear in mind, of course, that the larger test files are the ones where it really pushes the system to have to work a lot harder. So again, obviously these performance figures are greater than those we saw on the RAID 0 test from previously, but still very good numbers overall. So next we're going to make our way into the Atto disk benchmark there. I'm sorry if the screen goes black every time I go into Atto disk benchmark. A lot of that is to do with Windows popping up for admin rights. So again, we can scroll down. This is where we have to use the iSCSI because you can't use a map network drive in the conventional version of Atto. So we're going to use our test file there. We're going to stick with the 256 meg file type we had before. and we're going to leave that on screen to complete that test. This takes a bit longer, and of course we're going to look at conventional read-write, and we're going to look at IOPS. And then later on, we just want to have a quick look at how that compares with the IOPS and general performance of the RAID 0 environment. So let's fast forward to the completion of this rather long test. Right, so we've completed our first stage of testing there, and as we can see on screen, we've hit some pretty good numbers of that 256 meg file type. Quite a small one, so it wasn't enough to really tax the system. We will be running a larger file type in just a moment, but at the 256 meg file type, we still hit that 1000 megs in the RAID 5 configuration quite a lot. There was some discrepancies there during write, it has to be said. It's going to be interesting to see if they exist later on in the next test. But for now, let's make our way into the IOPS next. Let's have a quick look there. Peaking at 18,000 and 14,000 write-read respectively. And pretty respectable numbers there, but once again, read slightly questioning that there to do with my core system and the OBS running. So next thing we want to do is run a 4 gig test file. So it's going to be a much bigger file this time. And this time we're going to leave on screen the comparative figures here of another test that we ran there on the 4 gig. That was on the RAID 0 environment, as you can see there. So it's a 4 gig. We're going to switch back to read-write environment, and we're going to run this test again. And this time we want to see how does it compare with the RAID 0 environment over 10G that we ran on iSCSI before. So let's go ahead and begin this test here on screen. And then what we're going to do is fast forward to see how this compares with the previous results of that RAID 0. Let's fast forward. Right, so now it's completed, we can take a good look at that read and write performance. In fact, let's put them side by side without worrying too much about the graphs there. So let's pop that there, and on top of that, we can have the numbers side by side. Now, the first thing that strikes you about looking at those numbers is, of course, the write figures have dipped noticeably. Sorry, let's move that so it's a little bit more in alignment. The write figures are certainly that dipping point between the RAID 0 and the RAID 5 is notable. It's what we expected. It took place around about this level here, and if we have a look at the graph side, we can see that that performance dip at the 128K reaching into the 1 meg file types, that dip there was still notable that it occurred. So nevertheless, the read still exceeded that 1000 megs, which is exactly what you wanted to hear, and something that the map network drive test that we did previously was showing quite erroneously. Now, if we switch over to the IOPS, or the IO even, we can make our way into the comparison there of our previous testing. Drop that, move that more visibly on screen. We can have a look at how those two compared there. Let's bring that out a little bit. And if we look at those two side by side, again, we're looking at very, very similar numbers. Even at the top end there, I thought the difference between them would be more marked, but really, the RAID 5 actually surpassed it in a number of ways, which really, really surprised me. With regards to the RAID 5, RAID 0 comparison there, don't get me wrong, again, just like I mentioned earlier on, that's Gerald the Seagull still being a dick. As mentioned before, with the IOs, it's worth remembering that we're not comparing against SSDs here with their 50, 80, 120 and higher IOP levels. We are looking at hard drives here in a 4-disk RAID environment. Always very important to remember that. So, now we've looked at our Atto disk benchmark figures. Once again, we'll pop that there so I can take some screen grabs later. We're now going to make our way into some nice, straightforward Windows drag and drop. So what we've done, as mentioned, we've equipped those drives, and we'll come out of there. That's all my testing from previously. We can have there, we've got our map to network drive there of the whole system, and we've got our nice target there. So what we're going to do is run the test on the mapped drive, as mentioned before, and we're going to do a single 10 gigabyte test file into the mapped drive, and then we're going to run 10 gigabytes or 10.3 gigabytes of mixed files, around 6,000 files. So let's run the first test, and again, this is my live stream cap video there in a ridiculously high quality, and it's a 10 gig file precisely. So we're going to copy that there and copy it directly into the mapped network drive to see what kind of average performance we get via 10 GBE on this RAID 5 mapped network drive. Let's go ahead and see. Lovely to see we're hitting that 600 megs. We've dipped ever so slightly there, but we're still hitting quite a nice high number there via that 10 GBE connection. We're sending that 10 gig lovely and fast all the way through. Beautiful stuff there. So now let's do exactly the same test, this time on the iSCSI target. So again, we're looking for, if not the same, but better. Let's have a look. And already a much faster early start. We hit that high level and maintained that high speed for a great deal longer. The access time significantly faster, and definitely, as suggested, the speed of the iSCSI target fast passing that of a map network drive. So next, we're going to go back onto the map network drive, and this time we're going to copy over 10.3 gig of mixed files. So we can see there in one of my backup files there, 10.3 gig of data there. And again, that is over 6,000 files. So we'll keep that there on the side of the screen. So we're going to go ahead and copy those files. And we're going to copy those into the mapped network drive first. So we're going to keep that benchmark there on the side of the screen. And the thing to note here, and this is where that I/O readings from Atto takes place, and a little bit more important, because now we're going to copy a huge volume of files, and the larger files are actually going to move a lot easier. Whereas the randomized or comparatively randomized access of the smaller file types is where you're going to see that performance dip into double figures in some cases. So let's go ahead and transfer over our 10 gigabytes of mixed files over 10 GBE onto this RAID 5 environment. So let's run that there. And again, this will take a little bit longer. So this is one where I'm going to have to fast forward, because otherwise you're going to have to hear me talk for the best part of a few minutes. And I know some of you like that, but the majority of you probably don't. So I'm going to enjoy my coffee a bit more and fast forward to the completion of this exercise. So again, lovely and quick speed there. Probably not, when I've done in previous 10G testing, not as quite as nippy as the RAID 0, but that was to be expected. And once again, let's run that exact same test, this time on the iSCSI drive, copying that same level of files over, because again, I do think it's important to sort of weigh up the two side by side. I know I said I'd predominantly focus on the map network drive, but still, nevertheless, it's worth looking at the difference for the iSCSI target for you guys out there. They're a little bit more proficient, that intend to utilize these drives in a NAS in this way. So let's let that start. And again, much faster initialized speed there because of the access performance being a great deal better with the iSCSI targets. Remember, in DSM7 it is going to be switching to the SAN manager, but look at that tremendous speed difference there. And I think this is the real test there to show us some great performance. So again, I think I'm not even going to have to fast forward this one. Bang, and we're done. And just to double check, we'll go into properties just to confirm. As we can see there, it is 10.3 gig right there on that mapped drive. So again, we've got some lovely performance figures there looking at the RAID 5 environment. I think I'm going to wrap things up there. In my next video, I am going to be looking at comparative testing versus the likes of WD Red Pro, Ultrastar, and Seagate Iron Wolf and Iron Wolf Pro and Exos. We've already run a bunch of tests in other videos to do with noise, so we will be looking at noise generation from these drives and their comparative drives as well. It is worth highlighting that the follow-up test will be conducted in the brand new RS3621XS Plus, a 12-bay rack mount device. So it is going to be a lot of hard work to eliminate some of the sound while we've got that device a few meters away. I'll try my hardest. but it's going to be an 8 bay filled with 3 of the new Synology hard drives, 3 of WD Pro, Red Pro, and 3 Western Digital Ultrastar drives. Do stay tuned for that in the next stage of these tests, and otherwise I will see you guys next time.